Good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to this evening. We're conducting this event at our headquarters at Glover Cottages in Sydney and broadcasting it nationally and internationally through Zoom. Our guest speaker is James Curran, Professor of Modern History at Sydney University and a highly regarded analyst of international affairs and American politics. In a previous life, he worked in the Prime Minister's Department and the Office of National Assessments. He's also held the chair of Australian History at University College Dublin. His subject tonight is the problems of the past and the future in Australia-China relations. At the conclusion of his presentation, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions. Please log your questions throughout the presentation using the Zoom Q&A function. And now it's over to Professor James Curran.
Well, thanks very much, Ian Lincoln, the President of the Australian Institute of International Affairs New South Wales branch, for that kind introduction. I wanted to thank Jenny Sale as well for the invitation. I also wanted to thank the National Executive Director of the AIIA, Dr. Bryce Wakefield, for being here from Canberra today. Thanks to all of you for being here, a new experience for all of us in this COVID year, and thanks to all of you who are tuning in from wherever you are. Okay, in 1893, the English liberal intellectual Charles Henry Pearson, who used his Australian vantage point to observe the effect of modernisation on world politics, identified China as the greatest potential threat to Western strategic predominance. He said that the preponderance of China over any rival, even over the United States of America, is likely to be overwhelming. And he believed that his fellow Australians who lived on the frontier separating the white and coloured races were the first to raise the alarm and to take measures to hold the line for Western civilisation. As Pearson put it, he said, "The fear of Chinese immigration, which the Australian democracy cherishes, is in fact the instinct of self-preservation, quickened by experience." Now, in 1966, as Donald Horne surveyed his country's foreign policy at the height of the Cold War, he described a political community in Australia almost completely obsessed by China, with most narratives, he said, reflecting, quote, "the submerged theme of impermanence and even catastrophe in the Australian imagination." And last week, taking aim at Chinese economic coercion, the federal member for Kennedy, Bob Katter, lamenting the lack of diversification in Australia's trading portfolio and the need for greater defence expenditure, implored Australians to, quote, "remember that we live on an island with a vast coastline and are extremely vulnerable. We are overwhelmingly a European country in the middle of Asia with a land mass that is completely empty. A land without people," he said, "will be taken by a people without land." Now, each of these observations emerges from their own distinctive contexts, and each of them, of course, is speaking to unique circumstances. Nevertheless, they do show that the past has a tendency to recur again and again in the national strategic psychology. Pearson's work, National Life and Character, was quoted in the first parliamentary debates that established what became known as the White Australia policy, and it took governments of both persuasions until the 1960s and 70s to dismantle it. Within a decade of Donald Horne's article appearing, Australia had opened diplomatic relations with China, and its leaders defined the country as a multicultural community seeking comprehensive engagement with Asia. Mr. Katter's remarks are only the most recent example of a view which, since 2017, has emphasised Australia's economic, political and territorial vulnerability to China's rise. Now, in the third of his 4 quartets, the poet T.S. Eliot wrote, he said, "When there is distress of nations and perplexity on the shores of Asia, our curiosity searches past and future and clings to that dimension. But to apprehend," he said, "the point of intersection of the timeless with time is an occupation for the saint." Well, needless to say, I am no saint, nor do I have the gift for seeing around corners, but it's the quest to understand better that very intersection of the past, present and future which I seek to grapple with in my remarks tonight. As the Australia-China relationship continues to deteriorate, it becomes more imperative, I think, to understand why it plumbs the depths it has, but also how Australia might think afresh about its role in a new strategic order. So in tonight's address, I want to discuss two key points. First, I want to argue that for all the newness of the circumstances that we face with China's rise, some analysts and commentators continue to clothe their treatment of the subject in older conceptual garb. So many of the paradigms and rhetoric of the late 19th century and the Cold War, especially those relating to invasion, threat, subversion and containment, have once again been resurrected and deployed in the domestic political and foreign policy debate. Now, true it is that at the core of this challenge is raw power politics, but that does not mean that questions of culture, history, identity and memory are irrelevant. Indeed, they are absolutely central. And yet to date they have been largely neglected as factors which influence Australian reactions and responses to this seismic strategic shift. Last year, the former Singaporean diplomat and UN ambassador Kishore Mahbubani posed the question of whether we arrive at geopolitical judgments only from what he called cool, hard-headed, rational analysis. Or whether, he said, if emotions do influence these judgments, whether they operate at the level of our subterranean subconscious. Any honest answer, he said, would admit that non-rational factors always play a role. Now, Mahbubani was writing in the wake of the revelation that the State Department's then head of policy planning, Kieron Skinner, had spoken of US-China strategic rivalry in terms of a clash of civilizations. And moreover, as she put it, that China was the first non-Caucasian great power competitor that the US had faced in its history. Skinner's speech had the briefest of shelf lives, and Australian leaders went nowhere near it. But Mahbubani was surely right in pointing to the need to examine the cultural impulses that produced the speech. That China, he said, is not Caucasian is a factor in the geopolitical contest, and it may also explain strong emotional reactions in Western countries to China's rise. The revival of so many images of China that speak to older fears and phobias has cramped the space in which political leaders here can attempt to achieve something of an equilibrium in Australian China policy. They give the debate a Manichaean flavour, and they impose a poisonous fault line between the advocates of engagement and the acolytes of aggression. And this has led to the brazen, offensive questioning of the loyalties of Australians of Chinese background and others. All of this seems to get lost in much of the analysis of our present predicament. The second point I want to discuss tonight is how to come to grips with thinking about Australia's role in this new order. This era is indeed totally unlike anything Australia has had to face in its history. Now, the country has in the past had to undergo a fundamental rethink of its position in the world at the time of post-war decolonisation and the rise of Asian nationalism. And also when the British military withdrew from east of Suez in the 1960s and the United States, under the Nixon Doctrine, was recalibrating its Asia policy. It also had to do it at the end of the Cold War. But at each stage, Canberra did so with a great and powerful friend placing a comforting paw on its shoulder. Now, however, finding itself closer to the centre of these new geopolitical forces and with doubts, even if largely unspoken, about the growing gap between American resolve and capability in Asia, Australia must face up to the hard thinking of what that new order, already taking shape, might look like. Now, the American paw is still there, and of course, many want it to continue to be there, but we worry what the picture might look like if its regional presence diminishes. What I'm trying to say here as well is that the mantra that Australia changed its policy towards Beijing because China changed, whilst accurate, it's also tending to impede a fuller understanding of why we are where we are. And I think it dodges completely the need for Australian policymakers and commentators in particular to ask questions of themselves. Let me be clear that there is no false equivalence being set up here. We know only too well that China has changed, that as the shift of economic weight to Asia has taken place, President Xi Jinping has wrapped it in an assertive, provocative and bullying brand of Chinese exceptionalism, one which provides the ideological araldite of modern Chinese identity. We've seen the manifestation of it in the South China Sea and the party's selling of the China model to other developing countries. We've seen it in Beijing's treatment of the Uyghurs, its sabre-rattling in Hong Kong, its testing of Taiwanese resolve. And we've seen it, of course, in the economic coercion that has hit a growing number of Australian export markets. And it's come as well with a blustery, discordant and self-defeating soundtrack of wolf warrior diplomacy. This is, though, the China with which Australia and others must learn to deal. Now, the conventional wisdom, and again, there's a great deal to be said for it, holds that a succession of measures taken by the Morrison and Turnbull governments on foreign interference legislation, the 5G network, the call for an independent inquiry into COVID-19 were entirely reasonable, either from the standpoint of national sovereignty, cyber security, protection of Australian communications networks and other critical national infrastructure, or in the case of the pandemic inquiry, an understandable desire to gain greater understanding and knowledge about the origins of a global pandemic. What remains a puzzle is why on each occasion Australian leaders saw the need to trumpet each move, either by statements that needlessly offended Chinese sensitivities or sought to gain kudos in Washington, or in the case of the pandemic inquiry, signal contempt for Chinese sensitivities on territorial integrity by pushing for the advent of UN weapons-style inspectors being put into Wuhan. Now, these have had the effect of positioning Australia at the vanguard of a wider pushback against China, and it seems that some have relished the role. Some years ago, a senior Australian official lamented privately that no one in Washington DC said that Australia was, quote, punching above its weight anymore. It's doubtful that that line is heard much now in the American capital. So this is a position that Australia has taken which has advantages for America, but not necessarily for Australia, particularly when you consider what is at risk and what is already being affected in terms of the critical trading relationship that we have with China. Equally, we need to better understand the origins of this approach and its consequences for Australian policy. Now, I think the first point to note here is that this more assertive stance predates the period from 2017 when the tensions with China came more fully into view. Thus, for example, in 2012, Australia's then ambassador in Washington, Kim Beazley, told incoming Foreign Minister Bob Carr that Australia's commitment to host American Marines in Darwin, its protests over Tibet and the exclusion of Huawei from the national broadband network meant that whilst Canberra was not exactly alone in our actions, as Beazley put it, he said Canberra was very prominent. Now, I think that shows an awareness, even back then, that Canberra's positioning at the forefront of issues related in particular to Chinese national unity and commercial interest were riling Beijing. Until the archives for this period are released or until further research with the key players is conducted, we can only speculate as to the thinking behind this approach. Whether it was a policy designed to send an early signal to Beijing as to what would and wouldn't be tolerated, whether it was deemed sustainable, what domestic effects it might have should tensions with Beijing increase, and whether ultimately it might result in Australia becoming a target for Chinese economic coercion. I mean, that's the puzzle, the policy puzzle, which I think we have to wrestle with. I think these are vital questions as to how these kinds of policy approaches emerged, what was the thinking behind them, and even more crucially, what was the objective of taking these positions. Now, one answer was given in the Australian newspaper yesterday by the former advisor to Julie Bishop, John Lee. Australia, he argued, is enduring, quote, a painful but necessary negotiation with Beijing. He said that it's creating room to exercise the rights of our sovereignty rather than exchanging that for silence, or worse, he said, servitude. And the question I have is, what does this actually mean for policy? And nor am I satisfied that it is all quite so clear-cut that what is being presented here as a carefully thought out, carefully calculated strategy, whether or not that masks what may well be policy ad hocery, the making of policy on the run. Certainly it is at the very least debatable as to whether there has been coherence to it, and indeed, I have to concede, whether or not coherence is possible in Australian-China policy at the moment. But if we are to climb out of the hole in which we find ourselves, what is also required is a searing examination of how we descended these depths in the first place. And if the former Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Dennis Richardson, is right, and there's little reason to doubt Mr. Richardson's assessment at present, that is that Australia will remain in the doghouse with China for at least the next 18 months to 2 years, then I think there's no excuse for not reflecting on the way things have at times been managed from the Australian end. Now, I hasten to add, because I know these are the sorts of remarks that people jump all over and misinterpret, that this quest for understanding is not born from a desire to finger point or apportion blame. As I said, rather it is to gain greater insight as to why impulse and emotion has at times been allowed to override a strong Australian tradition of pragmatic, reason-based and evidence-based diplomacy. Questions of culture and identity, as much as political tactics, shape our reactions to this seismic strategic shift, and we are not being intellectually honest if we ignore some of the ghosts that are stalking the debate. Now, there is a lot at stake here. Earlier this year, the Australian Financial Review's Andrew Clark noted that some around the Prime Minister were opining that he could use the China card as his trump in the next federal election. Now, if that kind of speculation has any substance to it, then the divisions on this policy challenge, especially at the community level, and most especially in terms of its capacity to keep building suspicion within the wider Australian community towards Chinese Australians, will sadly only intensify. This is not just a question either of pointing out the almost routine depiction in the Australian media of an Australian continent being flooded by oozing red tides of Chinese flags unfurling across the land from Sydney to Perth. The ABC is one of the worst offenders in this regard. Or of think tanks publishing reports with lurid yellow covers featuring images of prowling Chinese dragons, which can only be reminiscent of the Bulletin magazine in the 1890s. Or of other cartoons in other media outlets which feature routinely a dragon's tail lying akimbo to Australia's east coast, of Four Corners putting on documentaries that play spooky music as the camera enters dimly lit rooms. Rather, it is about examining two central narratives that have relied on older streams of history and memory to explain these new circumstances. Now, the first of these is the reliance of a China threat narrative on older themes of Australian innocence, vulnerability and complacency. The second is the reheating of the rhetoric and the terminology of the Cold War. Now, again, I should say these do not by themselves explain why Australia is ahead of the pack, why the relationship has hit a new low. What they do show, though, is the capacity of the relationship to become captive, not only to domestic politics, but also to the myopic vision of immediate experience and the uncritical mythologies by which events in the present are understood. So to take the China threat narrative, this interpretation emphasises a sense of sometimes feverish alarm over what it sees as Beijing's capacity to gradually erode the democratic foundations of Australia, thus ultimately rendering the nation hopelessly weak in the face of China's growing economic and strategic weight. Right? This is a predicament that is itself reminiscent of the invasion scare novel literature of the late 19th century. As much as it is characterised by machismo, it betrays a rather lamentable lack of faith in the resilience or robustness of Australia's democratic institutions. China in this school of thought is presented as an insidious force creeping into every corner of Australian life. In the words of its most vocal proponent, Clive Hamilton, China is bent on nothing less than a silent invasion of the country. Australia at risk, he says, of becoming a tribute state of the resurgent Middle Kingdom. The former head of ASIO, Duncan Lewis, gave a version of this view when he warned that Australians will one day, quote, wake up to find decisions made in our country that are not in the interests of the country. The result, he said, would be a foreign power virtually, quote, pulling the strings from offshore. This view also typically stresses the theme of Australian susceptibility to Chinese influence and interference, warning against the kind of complacency by those it claims have been engaged in appeasement advocacy. Taking his cue from Duncan Lewis, journalist Peter Harcher of the Sydney Morning Herald also asked, and I quote, "What is the use of all Australia's Defence Force personnel and all its ships and planes if the decision-making system has already been taken over by Beijing?" One of the problems for these accounts is that, notwithstanding the egregious affair of the former Labor Senator Samuel Dastyari, is that many of these analysts are unable to demonstrate conclusively that agents of the Chinese state have either influenced or changed key policy decisions in any federal or state parliament, or that the Chinese Communist Party has in any way had success in imposing its system on Australia. One result of this perceived vulnerability to China and Chinese influence has been the search for a viable response or strategic framework to meet it. Given the re-emergence of great power competition between the United States and China, it is perhaps unsurprising that an older concept, that is, containment, has been whistled in to service this very need. As Fareed Zakaria has noted, even if few embrace the term containment itself, many adopt some version of its logic. Now, this application of Cold War terminology and thinking is not a distinctively Australian response to China's recent assertion of its power. As in the Cold War, commentators and analysts here, largely in the hawkish school of thought, have followed in the footsteps of developments or major speeches in the framing of American China policy. In the Australian case, the application of the term Cold War 2.0 has a clear beginning and coincides with a reaction to a speech that was delivered by the American Vice President Mike Pence to the Hudson Institute in Washington in late 2018. Now, in prepared remarks on that occasion, Pence detailed a catalogue of grievances concerning Chinese behaviour across economic, domestic, technological and ideological spheres. Towards the end of his speech, Pence declared that the United States will, quote, not be intimidated and will not stand down, adding that, quote, the US will not change course until China changes its ways. Now, those remarks were quickly and eagerly endorsed by a number of high-profile strategic analysts in Australia. One of them wrote that future historians will mark October the 4th as the beginning of a second Cold War, while others encouraged the government to, quote, follow in Mr Pence's footsteps, or declared, in the words of another, that Australia is broadly comfortable with the Pence approach. Rory Metcalf at the ANU's National Security College has subsequently reached a little further back than the Cold War to the rise of Japanese militarism, claiming that China's military, he says, has a grip on foreign policy that is reminiscent at times of the hardline officer class in 1930s Tokyo. In the Australian Parliament, these views have been most closely associated with backbench Liberal MP Andrew Hastie. who's argued that misplaced Western expectations of an economically open China, ultimately liberalised politically, represents a broader Western intellectual failure, he said. And Hastie equated that failure to the French belief in 1940 that, quote, their steel and concrete forts would guard them against the German advance. Such a view constituted only the latest example of a politician appealing to the supposed lessons of Munich and the rise of Nazi Germany, the period that has haunted the Western strategic imagination since the end of the Second World War. Now, I think it's interesting, I should say here as well, that it is highly debatable, and I am researching this at the moment, the extent to which Australian politicians and leaders took the view, especially in the 1980s and 1990s, that China would, the more it was brought into the international economic system, that it would ultimately liberalise politically. That view was expressed time and again by American leaders and policymakers, particularly after the end of the Cold War, but it is not an assessment that you will find in Australian politicians' speeches in that period. There is, I think, more work to be done on the conversations that Prime Minister Hawke was having with reformist leaders, Zhao Ziyang and Hu Yaobang, in the 1980s. They were giving Hawke a particular interpretation of actual and potential democratic reforms in China, but those conversations have not yet come across my desk, but I hope they do soon. I think it should be pointed out too that there's also been a number of analysts who've pointed out the flaws of this Cold War analogy. It should also be stressed that neither the Australian government nor the Labor opposition have endorsed this concept of a new Cold War with China, nor the idea that Beijing is a strategic competitor to Australia. Nevertheless, that perspective, that Cold War perspective, has also been influential in discussions about the kind of regional architecture required to check Chinese power, and how best an ally such as Australia can stiffen American resolve to maintain its staying power in Asia. And I mean, I think what's been quite significant there is the language and the framework that's been set out by someone like a Peter Varghese, for example, the former head of Foreign Affairs, who's explicitly said that Australia should not go down the path of following the United States into a simplistic kind of containment doctrine. Varghese has come up with another framework which is all about engaging and constraining China's rise, but Australia doing that in concert with its regional neighbours. On the other hand, you've had a lot of advocates of the Quad, which of course is gaining more momentum all the time, but a lot of advocates of the Quad using language like, as I think was used quite recently, that we're seeing with the military exercises taking place in Malabar, that we're seeing grey hulls arrayed in the sea lanes. It's that kind of language which I think is clearly putting that containment gloss on the Quad, even when members of the Quad don't necessarily want to give it that perspective. Certainly the Australians and the Japanese do not want to give it that perspective, and nor, I suggest, do India. The appeal, I think, of this Cold War imagery may very well speak to the longing, after nearly 2 decades of fighting the elusive scourge of jihadist terrorism, to have once more an existential ideological opponent. Remember, the Cold War has its own soothing memories. An entire system collapsed. Walls fell down. Victory was declared. But I think using it now is the equivalent of putting on a very old but comfortable pair of strategic slippers. Now, all of these accounts, I should stress, even those that tend towards the polemical, constitute the first draft of history. Notwithstanding the legitimate claims that Australia is facing up to a new and more uncertain era in its strategic outlook, a persistent sense of geopolitical anxiety has been a factor in the national imagination since the end of the 19th century, even from the middle of the 19th century, with the building of Fort Denison to protect us from a possible Russian invasion. But now, as the debate only intensifies over the course and the trajectory of Xi's China, it is again worth asking, to what extent can these concerns about Australia's cultural and political geography be seen as reasonable, prudential assessments of dangers? Or have they been in part, the paranoid responses of a small Western-based nation to a sense of living once more in an uncertain and unpredictable world. Writing a few years ago, as the tensions in this relationship were just really starting to heat up, the historian Cheng Sin Pan concluded, looking at the history of Australia-China relations, he said that perhaps it comes as no surprise that Australia's close economic ties with China have not been able to sway its historical mindset. Now, I think that is a comment worth reflecting on, and it's worth further interrogation. If anything, he added, quote, this geo-economic proximity seems to have aggravated that anxiety. Now, one of the ironies of this is not hard to miss, I think. Here I am talking about these older images from history, that some analysts have been ransacking the back catalogue of Australian history to come up with older images to explain new strategic circumstances. And to some extent this is understandable. Sometimes analysts, even if unwittingly, comb the past looking for some kind of framework with which to make meaning of the present, a present that we are all grappling with. But one of the ironies of it is that in the late 1970s, and indeed again in the middle of this year during the Deputy Chinese Ambassador's speech to the National Press Club, but Chinese officials have said explicitly to their Australian counterparts, I'm thinking of what was told to Gary Woodard in the late 70s when he was Australia's ambassador to China, that officials in Beijing said, as far as they are concerned, there are no problems left over from history in terms of how China understands Australia and the relationship with Australia. Now, thinking about when it was said to Gary Woodard, it is a remarkable statement to be made to an Australian ambassador in the shadow of the Vietnam War, not to mention the demonising of China that had taken place, especially throughout the 1960s and further back into the 19th century, the gold rush and so forth. But essentially, I think the key point was that the Chinese on that occasion were showing a preparedness to wipe Australia's historical slate clean, at the same time affirming that Australia carried none of the baggage associated with the big power dynamics and historical memories that typified its relations with Japan and the United States. Now, that observation that China had been telling, the Chinese officials had been telling Australian diplomats and others that there were no problems left over from history, this continued to inform the way that Australian officials prepared advice for governments in the 1980s. In other words, telling them here is an opportunity for Australia as the economic relationship and the boom in Chinese students was just starting to get underway in that period, which Ross Garnaut and Bob Hawke and others put into place. This was constantly sort of reinforced to Australian officials to kind of underwrite the sense of here was a relationship that was about to take off. It had been difficult. I mean, at the end of the 1980s, if you go and read the cabinet submissions then, they were saying, look, it's a great thing that we've recognised communist China, but let's just not lose sight of the fact that we don't have a lot in common at this point, and that we certainly don't want to be giving the impression that we are making foreign policy decisions with China in mind. Right? That was at the end of the 1970s and the early 80s. Throughout the Hawke period, this kind of advice, as I said, is underwriting some of the optimism that is starting to come in, I think, to the relationship at that time. But in essence, I think what was happening here was that the weight was being taken out of the historical saddlebags. But the problem with so much of the debate today is that some, alas, are clearly keen to put new, old historical weights back in it. Now, all of this begs the question as to how Australia continues to grapple with this new order taking shape. In his recent book, the former ambassador to China, Geoff Raby, stresses that foreign and strategic policy has to be based, he says, on a contemporary understanding of how profoundly the world order has been changed by China's inexorable rise. He said, quote, that we need to navigate a new bounded multipolar order with great skill. Now, Raby has proposed in this book a new grand strategy for the country, and that is a term, with one or two exceptions, that hasn't often been heard in Australia's foreign policy debate. But it's required, he contends, not because of Australia's strategic weight, but because of the very real prospect, as he sees it, that Australia will find itself increasingly alone. Now, Hugh White has also made that argument, and Raby agrees with him that defence spending has to rise. I think there is a difference, though, in Raby's realism, in that such a strategy, whilst needing to acknowledge that China will be the dominant power in East Asia, nevertheless, as Raby says, is also based on a reasonable assumption of the United States' continuing military preeminence. And where Hugh White stresses Australia plunging into unknown strategic waters with few navigational instruments to chart the new coordinates, Raby looks to the middle power activism of the Hawke and Keating governments as a model for the kind of diplomacy that Australia needs to practice. He says, expand the Quad by all means, but let China join it. And he calls for new inclusive security architecture for the region. I think this is the immense task facing Australian policymakers and thinkers now. All of it, I think, should be approached with some optimism. And indeed, with the signature of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, with a more active Australian foreign policy in the Pacific, with renewed focus on Southeast Asia, governments are, in their own way, responding to this new world. Now, this has always been something of a journey for Australian foreign policy. It will always have its inevitable twists and turns. Remember that from the 1970s, Australia found the process of integrating itself with Asia extraordinarily complex. It was in an awkward situation. It was, in the words of one commentator, quote, a country in search of a region. Or, as the head of the Foreign Affairs Department in 1986, Stuart Harris said, and I quote, we are an isolated country in the sense that there is a lack of regional links. There's no region or grouping to which we belong naturally, and no easy alliances that are immediately useful to us. This recurring sense of being alone made Australians anxious, but it also drove them on to seek to create a region to which they could belong. Thus, in the 1980s, Australia engaged in an extraordinarily active, multidimensional and constructive diplomacy aimed at achieving just that end. Whether it be APEC, the APEC Leaders Summit, the Cambodia Peace Accords, the Canberra Commission, the Bali process on people smuggling and trafficking. But it has been some time between Raby's call for a new grand strategy and another time when Australian policymakers and foreign ministers, for example, had to go through a sustained attempt to come up with a new framework for Australian foreign policy. Now, the former Foreign Minister Gareth Evans and the former diplomat and author Bruce Grant tried to do this at the end of the Cold War, when they tried to set down the country's response to the coming of the so-called New World Order in the 1990s. And I think there are currents from that work, which after all was written by a foreign minister in office, and that gave it its own restrictions and limitations, of course, about what could be said. But there are nevertheless currents from it which I think are worth bearing in mind. That is, that Evans and Grant, in writing that book, were aware of the grand theses that were coming out of the United States to explain the end of the Cold War, such as, for example, Francis Fukuyama's end of history thesis. Huntington hadn't published his article in Foreign Affairs by then, but Fukuyama had. But Evans and Grant are not swayed by it when they're writing this book. They say, quote, that the course of history is rarely, if ever, the irresistible working out of forces in obedience to some discoverable law of human affairs. In other words, what they were presenting in that book was a reason-based, pragmatic Australian approach to understanding international relations. So Australia's middle power status and its practice, at least since the 1970s, of both adapting to a world that it cannot control and working through international institutions to further its interests, didn't encourage an attempt to produce final solutions. It might be said that Australia, lacking pretensions to omnipotence, was not in a position to claim omniscience. but what it did produce was intelligent, creative and activist diplomacy. I think that Australian foreign policy makers have understood and do understand that history is contingent, that no minds, no matter how great, can in any age fathom its mystery. They understand, as Evans and Grant did in that work, that history always has unexpected surprises up its sleeve, and that sometimes the best that policymakers can do is to tackle problems piecemeal and pragmatically, never knowing whether they will achieve their objective. The process then of conceptualising a new framework for Australian strategic policy will again be full of tension between the pulls of history and the imperative of geography, between what is and what we would wish to be, between experience which calls for prudence in protecting the national interest and hopes, even if they are tentative hopes, that a better world can emerge from it. Thank you very much.
Many thanks indeed, Professor Curran. Now over to our question master, who's going to shoot a few at you. Are you ready, question master?
I invite you all, our viewers, to enter your questions into the Q&A function. And I will begin with Scott Birchall's question. So his question is, isn't the incoherence of Australia's current China policy and subsequent revived racist tropes and aggravations a product of policy elites being unable to answer this question? Is China's behaviour typical of all great powers, i.e. not unique and to be expected, or because it is a communist state, i.e. it is ideologically driven? The former are correct in my view, but the latter groups seem ascendant in Washington and much of Canberra, including journalists, think tankers, and some academics.
Well, I think there's a lot to be said for the fact that, you know, as I said, these are new and different circumstances where the great power doesn't share the same political system. And I think the point I would make about that is that these concerns have come, I think, about China at the same time as the great power protector on which Australia has relied since the departure of Britain from the region, when the most pressing doubts and anxieties over American resilience in the region have started to appear. So I think it's no surprise that from 2016-17, towards the end of 16, when it started to take shape, the American political developments with the coming of Trump and the sorts of things he was saying about alliances, the fact that that alarm and that talk of a plan B for Australia's major security partner came at the very same time that Xi Jinping was starting to assert or starting to sort of flex his strategic muscles, particularly in the South China Sea and elsewhere. I think the coming together of them has produced so much of this kind of panic. So it's unfamiliarity with this great power. I mean, as Charles de Gaulle said, great powers are cold monsters. They're nasty. We've dealt with great powers before that haven't treated us so well, Britain and the United States, and we've walked out of Oval Offices and number 10 Downing Street with our tails between our legs because we didn't get what we want. But because of the cultural links, because of the history and heritage, you know, the kind of syrup of mateship has been able to ooze over any cracks in those relationships, right? Or in the case of Britain, the syrup of, you know, shared commitments to parliamentary democracy and the rule of law, love of cricket, so forth. But this time it's different, right? Because there's not that cultural syrup that can be poured over, you know, cracks and tensions in the relationship with China. So I think both factors are involved, but I think more work needs to be done on that kind of that coincidence of these two ill winds, if you like, blowing at the same time. Sure, Chinese assertiveness, but also great fear, I think, that Trump might start to rip up the Asian alliance system. Now, that didn't come to pass, but go back and look at the commentary at the time of the Turnbull phone call to Trump, and people, you know, in esteemed positions in Canberra think tanks saying, we need to come up with a plan B. If Trump gets his hands on the ANZUS treaty, things might happen. So the coming together of it, I think, explains why the intensity of the concern about China coming from a different system is, I think, at such a pitch.
Our next question is from the floor at Glover Cottages, and it's from Jocelyn Che. Who has changed? In 1972, China needed Australia. Now Australia needs China. But it is not simply a question of economy trumping politics, is it? Why is Australia leading a resistance against China and not consulting and coordinating with ASEAN neighbours?
Well, I mean, that is the big policy problem, right? How it's inexplicable. I mean, until we have the actual records which show, and whether in fact the records will show, the way in which this policy was put in place, I think it's a very difficult question to answer. I mean, I think some of the bridge building and some of the cooperation with the ASEAN countries is beginning, but I think there needs to be more of it. But at the moment, I think it's a reflection of policy being made on the run more than anything. Because when you think about it, when you think about the volume of trade that Australia has with China, I mean, has there been a clear, calculated strategy to put that at risk? Now, I don't think there has been. I think that's what's happening now. I think that's what we're facing now. And I think we've been surprised by it. I think there is there is some reassurance in looking at the way in which other countries that have suffered from this economic coercion, namely South Korea, the Philippines, Norway, have been able to climb out of it. In some cases, trade has increased, or given some of their trade that's been banned from going into China has found a different route through to China. So the picture is more complex. As one analysis from Shiro Armstrong at the East Asia Forum pointed to barley, Australian barley, increasing in terms of its access into the China market in July after the decision was taken in June. But yeah, more cooperation, I think, with neighbours is certainly part of the process. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, I think, is going to be a key driver in terms of more political cooperation between those who signed it, and in terms of sort of battling against some of the protectionist drift. But I think this is the question. Like, why did we adopt some of these positions where we were clearly out front? I do think that there are some sort of structural drivers to this which predate the coming of Xi Jinping in terms of China's economic rise from the mid-1990s, American distractions in the Middle East, the global financial crisis. It doesn't all just start with Xi. And in fact, if you go back and look at all the major Australian defence and foreign policy statements, particularly the defence ones, even in the mid-1990s, there is a concern being expressed that whilst China's growing military modernisation might be seen then as benign, nevertheless, they make the case even then that this will cause anxiety in the region. It's an obvious point to make, that this will cause anxiety if it starts to be used in other ways. And then I think, you need to go back and look at Kevin Rudd's lunch with Hillary Clinton, where he said that he was a brutal realist on China. So this is the other question. When did Australian strategic policymakers start to seriously talk about war with China? And it's the Rudd Defence White Paper with its secret annex, I think, that starts that process. So disentangling all of that, I think, is a major task for researchers.
We now have a question from one of our viewers, Andrew Phillips. James, how do you view the PM's recent visit to Japan in the context of tonight's discussion?
Okay, right. Well, look, undoubtedly I think the Prime Minister wanted to make an early call, the first call of a foreign leader on a new Japanese Prime Minister, to make sure, I think, that there was going to be no backsliding in terms of Japan's more forward-leaning posture. I think the negotiations clearly on the reciprocal services agreement had been started 6 years before and grew out of an entirely different context, which was in relation to disaster relief, but they are clearly being given much more geopolitical oomph given what's happening with China. I think we got out a little bit ahead in front by calling it a pact, and in some cases briefing of journalists to call it an alliance. The Prime Minister called it a landmark defence treaty. I think that's highly debatable, as I argued in the Australian Financial Review. But it is a significant development for Australia-Japan relations. There's no question about that. I wouldn't want to underplay it, nor the opportunity it therefore creates once it's signed for the Japanese to conduct those sorts of agreements with other countries. There will be a lot more, I think, to come about various clauses in the treaty that are proving problematic in relation to the death penalty. But clearly, China is the number one concern. I think there is a sense amongst some Japanese observers that they are quite happy for Australia to be more out front. It gives the Japanese space. One would have hoped that there was a discussion at that meeting between the two Prime Ministers about what each can learn, I guess, in terms of what China is doing. The Japanese, of course, have taken a very different approach, toughness with civility. They haven't withdrawn the visit invitation to Xi Jinping as yet. So one can only speculate on the exchange of views, but overall very significant, and in the context of the relationship in its own right, significant in terms of China's rise, but it wasn't the hyped up agreement that I think was sold to the press.
We now have a question from the floor of Glover Cottages. This one's from Alison Bronowski. Is China using Australia as a low-cost example of what it can do to countries that oppose it? If so, why do we side with the US to dominate our foreign and defence policies?
I don't think there's any doubt, Alison, I don't think there's any doubt that we are being used at the moment as a kind of a whipping child in order to send a clear message that this is what happens with pushback. This is what is going to happen to key US allies who engage in this kind of pushback against China. Now, I think you raise a key issue here. I'm grappling with this myself because, on the one hand, if you do an archaeological dig through the Prime Minister's speeches since he came to office, he has been at pains on several occasions to say, I don't want a Cold War with China. I eschew a binary or zero-sum prism. I think Australia, he says, has a very different view of China's economic rise to the United States. He even, at the beginning of his Prime Ministership, talked about China and the United States as Australia's new great and powerful friends. Now, he's since stopped using that phrase. And there he was at the policy exchange a couple of weeks ago saying, I want the end state of this relationship to be a happy coexistence. And again, he was talking there about the differences between American and Australian China policy. See, I think the problem, if you're trying to look at it from China's perspective, if I could just speculate, the problem from their perspective is not that we are Western, it's that we are seen as soldered on to the United States position and therefore as inauthentic. I mean, I think there needs to be a much better selling job in terms of the history of Australia taking positions both within and sometimes without the alliance. I mean, these episodes are kind of glossed over and sometimes there can be a tendency to say, well, but at the end of the day, we're still in lockstep with the United States. And look, sometimes we are. I mean, if, for example, you were to put those statements of Morrison alongside the toast that he gave at the White House for that state dinner where he toasted the next 100 years of mateship, well, how would Beijing respond to that, right? There's more nuance in Morrison's speeches that I think than he's given credit for, but the big kind of rhetorical kind of punch is about we don't want America to lose its capability and its presence in Asia. And that seems to me to be that's the stronger message that's overriding the more nuanced position. And that, as you know, Alison, that comes out of deep historical experience, deep sort of, currents running through the Australian strategic DNA. I mean, I sometimes think about this, when you think about, the end of empire in Australia, the 1960s, when the Brits pulled out of east of Suez and they were making their EEC intentions clear. I mean, there was a complete meltdown in the policy circles. I mean, Hugh White makes the point, he thinks Australia handled that period very well. Well, I think you go back and look at the reactions. I mean, when you've got newspapers at that time saying, you know, that Australia was facing a Far East death warrant as the United Kingdom was pulling its troops out, I think also what it shows you is that the Australian strategic imagination and the political elite, I mean, it took a long time for that sense of Britain being a protector, even after the fall of Singapore. It took a long time for that to kind of seep out of the system, right? So, you know, I think a lot of analysts have made a very key point, you know, that the American strategic posture in Asia hasn't changed much. For all their concern about what's happening in the South China Sea, it hasn't changed a great deal. And I think that's where some of the doubts about American resolve are coming through. And they are doubts that I don't think can be given public expression. All right? I think the Prime Minister and I think successive Prime Ministers have understood that the electorate wants reassurance, and they get reassurance from the American alliance. Compare, for example, you know, Julia Gillard talking about the comprehensive strategic partnership with China during her Prime Ministership, euphoric statements about this will be a great step forward. But put that alongside the agreement to host 2,500 Marines in Darwin, they don't compare. The Marines are still there. The comprehensive strategic partnership is like a strategic gibbet sort of swaying in the breeze, right? With no content now. It was set up as a framework for regular leaders' meetings and exchanges at official level. And Peter Varghese has called for it to be scrapped. But Morrison is still using it. And I think he's trying to signal that he wants a broader relationship. Now, I'm starting to wander off topic here, so I'll stop there. But I think it's an important question. There's a mismatch, right, isn't there, between the nuance on the one hand and the kind of, you know, traditional, you know, the mateship in the next 100 years on the other.
Yep, this will be our last question, and it's one from our viewers, Artyom Gurian. How will China's growing influence affect the island states of the South Pacific? Is further militarization of the region possible, or will Canberra compete with Beijing in the area of aid?
Well, I think Canberra's already competing in the area of aid. I think the light has well and truly gone on there in terms of the threat that's posed by Chinese incursions into the Pacific. I think it's at some points there's been a tendency towards some level of hysteria there, but on others there has been a clear policy objective to make sure that Australia is able to step in and to show the kind of support across many factors of policy that these Pacific states need, so that when China comes knocking, they've got a viable alternative. So I think the government is on course there. Okay.
Warmest thanks, James, for a fantastic, an eloquent and lively address, and some great phrases for us to take away. The comfortable old slippers of the Cold War, ideological araldite, or the warm syrup of our relations with our former great power friends. Terrific stuff. Thank you very much indeed. Next Tuesday, do join us for our last event of the year, which will be a panel discussion on the challenges Australia faces in 2021. Our panellists will be Jeff Miller, Professor Jocelyn Che, and Dr. Jonathan Simons. So please join us next week at the usual time, and thank you very much for joining us tonight.